I want to do a couple of beginning things. First of all, I want to introduce Yahaira Ortega, who's the co-host with me. She is our policy associate with Thrive Alliance. My name is Petra Sultan. I'm the director of policy and no, I'm not. I'm the director of advocacy and education. Sorry, just came back from vacation and my old titles kicking in. Advocacy and education for Thrive, the Alliance of Nonprofits for San Mateo County, where we strengthen people and organizations and communities through policy and advocacy, cross-sector collaboration, and capacity building. So I think the three of you know, and anybody who watches the recording afterwards, we've been very involved in educating our community about redistricting because it is a huge topic that's really going to affect the next 10 years. And this is our opportunity to have influence over that. So before we do that, I wanted to let you know about a couple of things that are coming up with Thrive that might be interesting this afternoon. We have the new executive director of the Sobrato Family Philanthropies Foundation talking about the new direction for the Sobrato Philanthropies, and you are all welcome to that this afternoon. In addition, on September 23rd, we're going to be doing a training on the new California Grants Portal. California realized that it was really hard for people to find grants, and I'm sure any of you who've looked for funding realize that that is true. And so they've created a new portal that makes it much easier to search and find grants. So there'll be a training with the person who developed that on September 23rd. Additionally, we're going to be doing trainings soon for the California Relief Grant Program. Those are for any small business. And I want to remind you that nonprofits are also small businesses. So if you know a small business or if you are a nonprofit and are looking for relief funding, we will be doing trainings on that this month. They are due on September 30th. And the last thing is, you guys all know that there's a recall election coming up and there has been some confusion around it. So among other things, we have a really great one-pager, a recall fast facts sheet that has information that you can use and you can send out to your community. We'll be putting all of these links in the chat. But you can also always go to our website. And I also wanted to let you know that Yahaira has been fantastic about following all of the different redistricting that's happening in our county and has created a webpage on the Thrive website that you can always use as a shortcut to get to what information there is about the redistricting for all the different redistricting that's going on in the county, as well as a lot of resources and recordings for all of the trainings. So with that, and for the people who came later, if you can introduce yourself on chat, that would be great. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Oh, and I want to thank, Grow Foundation, SVCF, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and Menlo Together for co-sponsoring this with us. Julia Marks is the staff attorney for redistricting and voting rights and all kinds of great things with Asian Americans Advancing Justice. She has been a tremendous resource and a tremendous help to Thrive as we're doing all of these trainings, and we are eternally grateful, and we're grateful for her for coming today and sharing her knowledge with us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julia.
Great, thank you. Thanks for hosting this and all your work on redistricting to Thrive, and also thanks everyone who's here for your interest in this very important topic. I prepped some slides for today, so we're going to start there, but I definitely won't be on slides for a full hour. So there should be plenty of time for Q&A. And we are going to also save some time at the end for small groups so folks can practice talking about their communities of interest. We can talk about it at a big level, but I think to really understand it, whether you're working on the government side or planning to give testimony yourself, it really helps to sit down and talk through your own community. So we'll start off with the slides. I will do a screen share. Just set it up. Okay, can folks see this okay? Great. So our goals for today, we're going to review the basics of a community of interest, and also kind of think through what the core parts of community of interest testimony are and why those parts are important to ultimately shaping the district map. And then I'm going to go through a few different online tools that can be helpful both in your own kind of thinking about your community, can also be used to draw out the boundaries of your community of interest to provide to the line drawers as input. And then we'll also look at a mapping tool where you can play around with your own district proposals and district boundaries. And then, as I mentioned, we'll break into small groups to practice. So a quick recap, I think everyone here understands that redistricting is very important, but it helps to remember why, right? So this is really consequential. It'll matter for the next 10 years. And redistricting and district lines really affect both, the actual voting process and who is putting in a ballot for each seat, and who gets to, elect those candidates. But it also affects like on the ground work, right? How do people organize? How do people have conversations with their neighbors about holding politicians accountable, about speaking up and identifying the issues that matter to them? So it helps to just be grounded in this when we think about what is a community of interest and what might bring people together to speak up to a redistricting commission or a city council to affect the boundaries. So, folks know redistricting is happening at many levels. The state process is pretty far underway, but it's not too late to provide testimony to them about where your community is located and what its interests are. The state has not started drawing their districts yet, so they're still collecting community of interest input. And as we'll talk about in more detail, community of interest input is really like a very essential building block once they start trying to actually draw the district boundaries. So if you have not provided your input to the state commission yet, you should do so. And then there's also the redistricting happening at local levels. So San Mateo County and a handful of cities in San Mateo are all doing their redistricting processes. There are also special districts and school boards that are doing redistricting. So check your local area. Thrive has a great list of all the different places where this is happening. So we're focused today on the requirements for counties and cities. It is quite similar for state and somewhat similar for special districts. So the criteria aren't quite as rigid for special districts and school boards. But the criteria for counties and cities are very clear. They're set out in state law. This was a law, the Fair Maps Act, that really reformed redistricting in the last decade. So this is the first time we're seeing cities and counties across the state redistrict with this very clear set of criteria. So first, they need to comply with population equality. Second, they need to comply with the Voting Rights Act. This basically means if there's a history of exclusion of a certain racial group from political power, and that group could be 50% or more of a district, the city or county has to draw that district where that group can be 50% or more. So if folks have questions, we can talk about that in more detail in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. The next criteria is contiguity. Each district needs to be connected to itself. You can't have one spot over here and another spot over here. And then what we're really focused on is the fourth criterion, which is that the district should keep local neighborhoods and local communities of interest together to the extent possible. So this means that if you have a neighborhood you're aware of, or if someone has come to you and said, this is my community of interest, here's where we're located, this is why we should be kept whole, the line drawers need to do their best to not draw a line that breaks that community up into separate districts. And this is fundamentally goes back to those 3 reasons we talked about of why redistricting matters. If you have a community where people have shared policy concerns, they would want to vote together to elect a candidate who will address those policy concerns. If you have a community with shared policy concerns, they would want to organize a meeting or organize a letter writing campaign or a call-in campaign to push their elected representative once they are in office to follow through on their promises or to address an issue that they might not be focused on but are interested in doing more work on. So it's a way for the communities with shared interests to make sure that their elected official can continue to be responsive to them, And we've seen examples in past redistricting cycles where sometimes inadvertently, sometimes intentionally, a neighborhood or a community is broken up between 2 districts. And it makes it a lot harder for them to organize. And it also means that when they're at the ballot box, there aren't as many folks from their community with their interests getting to weigh in the election. And so it's harder for them to actually elect candidates who will pay attention to their issues. So number 4 is really the crux of why redistricting matters to community power. And it's also one of the legal requirements that those communities of interest be respected. And so because of this, it's a really important way for communities to affect the line. By speaking up and pointing out where they're located, the line drawers now have to think about how to keep those communities whole. And it's very hard to comply with all the rank criteria and keep every community together, get perfect population equality, et cetera. So there will be some instances where some of a community of interest or a neighborhood might be broken up a little bit, like maybe an edge will be, cut off. But this is the 4th rank criteria. So it is really one of the more important criteria. And there's a lot of room for people to raise this up and advocate around it. The other criteria are to keep cities together. This only will apply for, the county redistricting. It doesn't apply if the city itself is being redistricted. And then to follow natural and artificial boundaries like freeways or rivers or hillsides. And then finally, to be compact. So if your community of interest is a funny shape or kind of long and stretched out, perhaps along a highway or an industrial area, you can uplift your community of interest. And the fact that being kept whole might mean that the district boundary is a little funny shaped or long and skinny. That's not a reason to cut up a community. Communities of interest is much higher ranked than the compactness criteria and following natural and artificial boundaries too. So that's just something to keep in mind. I think sometimes people have a gut instinct that a simple shape is a fair shape, but the law is very clear that keeping communities of interest is more important than creating a compact or simple looking district boundary. So I talked about some of this, but just to reiterate, communities of interest are really important to community power and the function of our democracy, right? Where people are responsive to their constituents. So that's why community of interest is the 4th criteria in this. And so a community of interest, oh, yes.
That's all right. Can I call you back?
Oh, okay. So a community of interest, the technical definition is that it's a community with shared common or social economic interests that should be included within a single supervisorial or city council district for purposes of effective and fair representation. You'll notice this is pretty broad, and that's because there's a huge variety of things that can bring a community together, and there are a huge variety of interests and concerns that are implicated in policymaking and in our government institutions. So this is intentionally broad and a wide array of input should be valued and respected by the line drawers. So when you're preparing to talk to the line drawers about your community of interest, and I'm using line drawers as a shorthand because I know depending on your jurisdiction, this is happening in different ways. For example, there's an advisory commission for the county. Some cities have their own independent commissions. Some cities, the city council will be doing the line drawing with a consultant or with their city staff. So I just use line drawers to refer to both the person, the consultant who's putting, pen to paper on the computer to draw the lines, and also the decision makers who are directing the line drawers of how to go about coming up with the proposed district boundary. So when you're talking to the line drawers, it's really important to make sure you're giving them specific information about where your community is located, information about the shared interests of the community, and then to make your ask. And so I'm going to go through each of these in a bit more detail. I also wanted to note that by law, the local processes are supposed to give you multiple ways to provide this type of input. So there are going to be the public hearings. Some are already happening where you can call in or maybe going in person, depending on the health situation, to provide testimony orally. You can also provide it in writing or electronically, such as by email. So keep in mind there are multiple ways to share this information, and you can do what's most comfortable to you. So first, identifying the shared interests. You can think about, who are your neighbors, who lives in your area. That's a starting point that's pretty broad. It's often helpful to think about kind of socioeconomic characteristics or cultural characteristics, race and ethnicity. Sometimes people think about housing types. Perhaps there's a high density of senior living facilities in your area. Those folks will have perhaps shared characteristics around age, maybe disability, maybe socioeconomic status. You can also think about, family status. Are there multi-generational families around you? Are there a lot of young children? So people might have extra concerns around education quality and education funding. There's a whole range of things that to consider when thinking about the shared interest in your community. You can also think about what are the conversations people are already happening. Are there events or topics or policy issues that people are coming together around or talking about? One fun question I've seen is, if you were going to have a community meeting about some problem, what would people want to talk about or come together to address? So think about both the characteristics of the folks around you, but also some of these policy concerns and policy questions. Here's a list of, just as a starting point, some of the characteristics to think through and some of the interests and policy concerns that might come up. I will flag that sometimes we've seen in community conversations, it can be easier to start with the characteristics such as, this neighborhood has a lot of Korean restaurants and Asian immigrants. So that's a great starting point. But because the community of interest is supposed to be about shared interests as well as shared traits, it's really helpful to add on, after you've talked about what your shared characteristics are, add on what some of those shared interests are. So if you've referenced the fact that there are a lot of, Korean restaurants and Korean businesses in your neighborhood, and that's important, think about what some additional interests that arise from that are, right? So people might be interested in local business services and local business support. People might be interested in the streetscape and having a pedestrian friendly area to encourage people to come there and to visit those businesses. People might have language barriers if there's a large population of newer immigrants. And so those folks might have interest in, civil rights and language assistance and making sure that they can, fully participate in our democracy, even if they haven't fully learned English yet. So there's a whole range of ways that shared characteristics are a good starting point, and then you can use that to talk more about some of the really specific shared interests in your community. So we'll be able to practice some of these later, and I can share this out if this is a helpful list. But I did want to quickly mention another approach some folks take to brainstorm their COI is to think about what types of decisions are being made at the level of government they're trying to affect. So if you're talking about your community of interest to the State Redistricting Commission, you might think about what are the policies that your state assembly member is deciding. If you're talking about community of interest to talk to city council, you might also think about what are some of the local issues that your city council member really has power over. So if you keep it more general, that's fine too, but sometimes thinking through the specific issues for the level of government can kind of inspire some interesting conversation, especially if you're working in a group, a neighborhood group, or a coalition, to think together about what your community of interest really cares about. And I should clarify, you don't necessarily have to like put a policy proposal right in your community of interest, but framing the themes that are of concern to you is important. Okay, so the other piece that's really important, right, is where is your community of interest? The reason this impacts the maps is because the community of interest is supposed to be kept whole. The line drawers can only keep it whole if they know where it is, like where the boundaries are. So I'm going to get into some tools about that. I did want to briefly share this resource. I'm not going to open it up, but here's a link for folks. If you want to learn more about your community, like you have a sense, like, oh, I think there are a lot of renters near me, but I'm not really sure. There's a series of maps you can access that were created by Advancement Project California, and they have about 15 or 20 different characteristics and heat maps. And so you can actually go to this link and look at various characteristics and zoom in on your neighborhood and kind of get a sense of whether some of your understanding of your neighborhood dynamics kind of lines up with the data. Another idea is if it does line up, you can zoom in and take a screenshot and include it with your community of interest testimony. So then the line drawers are both hearing your story and your narrative and your explanation based on your personal experience. And then they're also seeing some data that support the story you're sharing. So this is another resource that folks might want to explore as they're thinking through their community's characteristics and interests. Okay, so as I mentioned, location is very important. The simplest thing to do is to just, get on a map and draw around where your COI is located. But that can be a pretty hard exercise. So we recommend thinking through, what are the key areas? Are there religious institutions, community centers, commercial centers, key businesses or schools or other gathering places that are really important to your community? You can identify those on the map and also identify the boundaries and submit those to the line drawer. The boundaries are important because if you do just identify a few key landmarks, the line drawers won't know how far from those landmarks to stop considering your community of interest. So they could focus in too narrowly and maybe miss some of the residential space around you that is part of your community. I'll also note occasionally people just say, oh yeah, my community of interest is, the Adams Point neighborhood, but not everyone agrees on what a neighborhood is or where it is. So naming specific streets and landmarks is really helpful to make sure that the line drawers are keeping whole the neighborhood that you actually want, right? Your neighborhood boundaries might be bigger than the ones on Google Maps, or might be bigger than the ones in your city's neighborhood listing. And then finally, after you've talked about your community, what the shared interests are, where the boundaries are, it's really important to sum that up and then make very clear to the line drawers that you are asking for your community to be kept whole in one district because it is a community of interest. It never hurts to remind the line drawers that that's one of the criteria they have to strive for when they're mapping, and be clear that it's very important to you, that the interests are so strong that your community should be kept whole to have fair representation. You can also, if there are other neighborhoods nearby that aren't a core part of your COI, but might have some shared interests, you can identify those areas too. You can talk about what those shared interests are, and you can ask to be kept in a district with them. There's no barrier to having multiple communities of interest. So if you talk about a core community of interest at a smaller level, but then can also identify a larger community of interest with some overlapping characteristics and interests, you can make that request as well and push for both to be kept together. Okay, so I was going to pivot to the online mapping tools. I can pause though to see if anyone has questions about what we've talked about so far. Okay, so for this one, I'm actually gonna go to the tools themselves. So one that is very user-friendly, that is not created specifically for redistricting, but that we've found helpful in different community conversations is My Maps, which is a Google product. Can you all see this okay? Yeah, okay. So basically what you can do with My Maps is just zoom in on a neighborhood. I'm going to do one that I recently spoke with someone about in Oakland. Or do we have a volunteer? We can do one of yours.
Let's do one in San Mateo. Who wants to talk about what the community of interest or?
I'm not qualified because I'm not a resident, but I think some people in this room are, so.
When you guys, don't be shy. But you can't superimpose the maps like the district maps on
So
this, can you?
I could in a different tool. I was going to share District R also, but some people find this to be a simpler way if you're having like a community conversation where you're trying to get a lot of folks to share. This is a faster and simpler tool, but we can also jump to District R if you want.
Why don't you show us how to use the Google one and then go to District R for a real live example? Okay,
great. So the Google one, I really don't like drawing on areas I'm not familiar with.
Go back to Oakland, Julia, because I think it will be interesting.
Oakland?
Yeah, the one
okay.
You can see how it works.
Okay. So you can, use this to zoom to an area. Okay, so Oakland Chinatown is the area I was talking with folks about. And so here they, said like, okay, we're along 14th Street. So you can basically use this line drawing tool to just draw an outline directly on the map. It's not super sophisticated, but that's in a way part of what it's nice. So you can say like core Oakland Chinatown, and just save it here. If you want to turn it a color, you can do that. Because I was in a conversation with someone where they identified, this is the core of Oakland Chinatown. Most of the businesses around there are Chinese, and there are a lot of seniors and immigrants who live in this area, and some lower income housing. But then the person I was talking to mentioned, oh, the broader downtown area has some other shared traits. So I think the whole thing should be kept whole. So what you can do is, add another layer if you want. So the person suggested keeping, actually, oh, that's wrong. Let me just delete that. Delete. Okay. They suggested keeping this whole area together. And so again, you can do kind of a rough, just outline and mark it on your map. So here they shared there were some other clusters with rental housing where people had similar interests, and also some senior living facilities where there were seniors who had similar interests to folks in Chinatown. And so it would be helpful to keep these areas together. So what you can end up with is, my Oakland COIs. So this is a kind of quick and easy way, just if you're on Zoom with someone or want to get your own COIs down quickly, to mark where they are. And then it's also nice because it's shareable. So if you're like, does this sound right? I'm not sure if I should cut the boundary at 14th Street or at 12th Street. It's really easy to share it with a friend or a neighbor and talk through it together. So that's kind of the basics of this. If you are going to use this approach, right, what you'll want to do is probably print it out and then attach it to your testimony that you're sending in. So that's just one of the simpler tools for marking your COI. Another nice thing you can do is you might say, okay, the Oakland, Oakland Asian Cultural Center is really important to us. And so you can just add it to your map, right? So then you have a variety of landmarks as well as boundaries that you can share with the line drawer. So that's the Google tool. I'll switch over to District R. This is more complicated. It is available for specific localities where the contractor has signed up for it. You guys are lucky because a lot of the San Mateo County localities are using this. So we can go to either the county level or city level. Does anyone want to volunteer to talk about their neighborhood now that I talked about one?
Everyone's quiet.
Okay.
How
Well,
about if we do the county level and do either, we have somebody from Supervisor Pine and Supervisor Horsley's office, so pick one of their districts.
Okay, so, oh, I should say, so one thing about this district R tool is it's useful for both drawing communities and drawing districts. For now, let's talk about drawing communities. So we'll go to, you pick drawing communities, go to the county you want. Linda, can you name a city or neighborhood for us to zoom in on?
I'm looking. Well, it's not in our district, but it's just one that gets a lot of attention, which is North Central San Mateo. It's in District 2. So it's kind of north of the 92, under the word Burlingame and above the word San Mateo, where you are.
Does this look about right?
I'm trying to see what that street is. Yeah, sort of around there.
Okay.
Under south of Peninsula Avenue, if you can see, which I think that's dot is.
Okay, so you can immediately see one of the reasons I do recommend Google for some folks is it is a little quicker for navigating. Let me make sure. So we can add a data layer that shows the current district.
So yeah, that would be the same. That east-west black line is correct.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I do think streets can eventually show, it's just slowly loading. So what you can do with District R is you draw in your community by selecting actual census blocks. It's easier than some programs, but can be frustrating for folks at times. So what you do is you change your brush size to scale, like how many census blocks you want to grab at once. So mine is pretty small right now. And so you can go through and say, okay, the neighborhood is here and here. I don't know, is that accurate? What else should we add in?
I keep going south probably until let's say 2nd Avenue.
Second, down here.
Yeah, kind of. I mean,
okay.
Just for grins.
And you can make the brush bigger to grab more. And it kind of auto fills, which means sometimes it grabs something you didn't really need to do, like adding the freeway. So I would switch to erase, and I can remove the freeway from the neighborhood. And then you can keep adding. So this is a great tool, but just not everyone necessarily wants to have the patience to process. I'm not sure, does the neighborhood cross the train tracks?
I think that is a question for the community to answer. It just
Okay.
If you wanted to play around with it. Petra,
okay, great.
Can you? Yeah, you might. I mean, it could go all the way to El Camino depending on who's answering.
Okay.
I think that's exactly, since the city of San Mateo is doing their redistricting, that's going to be a great question. Like, is it the train tracks? Is it El Camino?
Yeah.
Is it?
I mean,
is it 101?
What's interesting is just like it's a little bit different. The COI might be different for the city of San Mateo than it is for the supervisory district.
Yeah.
Because there's with respect to the county, I think you would definitely go to El Camino, but with respect to the city, it's probably for discussion.
Yeah. So for now, I'll leave it here. So you can name it.
Sorry, so the black line is a supervisory district?
It is. Yes.
So that little piece that's right there, yeah, that is city of San Mateo. So that line, that black line on Humboldt is the border between city of Burlingame and city of San Mateo.
Got it. And one thing that'll be interesting for the county mapping, right, is you'll recall in the list of criteria, city is below community of interest. So if folks living here end up saying that they, relate more strongly to their neighbors here, that would be a reason perhaps to move this line. I'm not specifically suggesting that change, but it's just an example of where you could have a community of interest that doesn't necessarily feel aligned based on city boundaries. That said, people often do feel connected through their city boundaries. So that's where the community input is so important to let folks know. So this is kind of the basics for documenting where your community of interest is. There are a couple things that are nice about this tool, right, that you don't get with something like Google. So you can see demographic information. So you can see, for example, the population, get a sense of density. Folks often like to see look at some of the race and ethnicity information. So what this is CVAP, and CVAP is the citizen voting age population. The reason we look at CVAP is that for Voting Rights Act compliance, what you're looking for is a 50% district based on CVAP, not based on total population. And that's the rule in the Ninth Circuit. It actually is different in other parts of the country. So just if you end up seeing other tools that refer to VAP, that's because the default in the rest of the country is voting age population, whereas here we look at citizen voting age population. So
can you repeat the sentence about the 50% part? Say that again.
Yeah, so Voting Rights Act obligations can kick in when you can draw a district that's 50% or more of a specific racial group. If that group has like a history of exclusion, which is usually the case for non-white groups in America. And also if that group does vote differently than other communities, such that the fact that they're being diluted means they can't elect the candidates of their preference. So when line drawing, you should be looking for opportunities to create 50% plus districts. That's kind of like the general starting point. If you find those opportunities, and any contractor who's doing line drawing should help do this assessment. If you find those opportunities, then you ask those questions about, does this community vote differently than other communities? Which would mean that if you don't draw that district, right, you're diluting their vote and making it harder to elect the candidates they prefer. And also, what are some of those other factors about political exclusion? And some of those factors are looking at, the history and the jurisdiction around voting laws and kind of the history in terms of who has been elected to represent these communities. If you're seeing a community that has a lot of people of color, but a lot of white people have been elected, that can help show that there is a history of discrimination and exclusion in that area. It doesn't need to be, explicitly stated racial discrimination, things like a history of, citing voting locations in places that are difficult for those communities to reach, or other things that aren't explicitly stated as discriminatory, but have a discriminatory effect. Those can be factors when thinking about whether the VRA comes into play. But the first step is really looking at the population. I'll also note that sometimes, and this is more relevant in the Bay Area because of the great diversity in the Bay Area, you'll see potentially coalition districts where you might not get 50% of a specific racial group, but you could get 50% of two racial groups together. And so the law is a little less clear on that type of Voting Rights Act issue. But it's important to look for those potential districts, especially if you're hearing from community members that they feel like they vote similarly, and being kept together will be really important to maintain their political power. So what this tool is useful for is that it allows you to look at some of those racial dynamics. Also, I'm sorry, I realized I went way over my planned time, but I'm happy to talk with folks one-on-one later. Another thing that's nice about this tool is it shows some of those other traits we talked about, like having multiple residents, multifamily residents, language spoken at home, income, these types of things. So you can kind of explore as you're thinking, oh, should I include this extra set of blocks? You can see, oh, we actually have a lot of similarities in these characteristics. Maybe that is something to include when I think about my community.
After you've checked them in that on the right, how do you see them?
So it is it's the
Shade.
gradation. Yeah. So you should have one or the other. You can't show both at the same time.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Because then, yeah, you won't be able to understand the gradation. So, yeah. Yeah. So something to play around in. So after you've drawn your boundary, you can save it. You can save it as a draft and come back to it. So you get a URL that's specific to yours. And then you can also, if you have a team or a coalition, you can name it and come up with proposals together. And then different jurisdictions have different ways of getting this information to the line drawer. So you should check for your jurisdiction how they want you to submit it. Some will let you submit it directly through this program. Others, you might need to print it out, which you can do, and attach it to an email or send it in by, if you want to send it by paper, because that's your preference, you can do that too. So ask for your local jurisdiction. And then the other thing Districtor allows you to do, it's a similar tool, is to draw actual districts. So here's San Mateo County. And what you can do is actually create district proposals. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to do some rough, like grabbing some land. Oh, I grabbed too much. Here's the yellow area. Okay. So you basically have 5 colors because there are 5 districts. And you can go through, obviously you'd want to zoom in and do this with more precision, but you can grab districts. And then over here, it shows you the population balance. And it has calculated the ideal, right? Because ideally each district is the same size. So here they took the projected 2020 population, divided it by 5, and they're helping you try to reach that benchmark. So I can see I have way too much in the blue area, but not enough in the yellow. So I might think about, oh, is there an area I can add to get closer? I'm just doing this to show you the tool. Obviously, you would want to zoom in and think about, oh, what COIs have I heard? Are there any Voting Rights Act implications? You know, have people raised some sort of set of priorities around like, this COI is the most important to me, but it would also be great if you could keep us with this neighboring area. That would all obviously go into play here. But just to show you how this tool will update as you make changes so that you can see the effect of what you're doing, you know, and sometimes you'll try to add a neighborhood and realize it overpopulates. And so then you'll have to think, okay, is there a different neighborhood that would make sense to move because that one's actually less of a community priority. So this tool is supposed to help you think through the trade-offs as you're trying to meet all the different competing goals.
Julia, is the numbers data and stuff, that's not quite fully, this is not the census data, it's still the American Community Service survey data. Do we know when it's going to be the actual census data and how much that matters?
Yeah, it will change. We've seen that it's not accurate. I'm not sure the degree of the change. It's not consistent. Some areas seem more off than others. The new data should be ready toward the end of September. So it's still, I think, useful if especially if you're having coalition conversations or community conversations, to start looking at this, because sometimes people really want a configuration that is just impossible from a population standpoint. And you might know, just based on these population estimates, that you need to think more creatively about how to make it all fit together. But yeah, it will change. And the redistricting partners and National Demographic Corporation are the main contractors in San Mateo for the cities and county. And they said they'd update toward the end of September with the new data. Yeah. Quickly, also, that you can do the population demographics filters here. So you can also see what the different kind of distributions are. And then again, they have the other demographics too, if you're interested in some of those socioeconomic or linguistic factors. And then they do this at the end. You can see an evaluation of the districts you're creating. So, sorry, let me take off these. So they'll show you, okay, the way you've drawn District 1, you have a majority Asian district. So that's something to keep in mind if you think there might be a Voting Rights Act claim there, right? You'd want to make sure you're maintaining that majority Asian district. So I didn't populate full districts, but this can be helpful to look at as you're mapping out the variations. Yeah, okay, apologies about time. But if folks have questions, I can stay on for a few minutes or meet with you separately. Those were the main tools I wanted to share. And I did create a set of questions if you want to practice. Oh, sorry, here are tips for drawing districts. I think I talked through these as we went. But I also created a set of questions if you want to practice on your own talking about your COI. Yeah.
Julie, I would really want to thank you for this. This was super cool to see it actually in action. And as we get more into this, we're definitely going to be using these tools. And thank you for your offer for questions. So if people do have questions, you can reach out directly to Julia. We will be sending a follow-up with all of this information. And by we, I mean Yahira. Thank you very much. And please always go to our redistricting webpage on our website so that you can see for your particular community which tool they're using and how to get a hold of what's going on and become active. And we really hope that people become active in this because it is so important. So thank you, Julia. And everybody have a good day.
Thank you all.